The dust in the compound settled in layers of fine ochre silt, clinging to everything: the rough khaki canvas of the tents, the splintered planks of the observation towers, the stiff wool uniforms of the internees. This was Camp Ruston, or perhaps Hereford, Texas, a sprawling, isolated Allied facility. Designed not merely for containment, but for the quiet, systematic dissection of ideological certainty. It was a place where the American sun beat down with a relentless, indifferent heat, baking the very air until it felt heavy and metallic. A stark contrast to the misty, northern Europe from which most of the prisoners had been torn. Within this landscape of confinement, where the horizon shimmered with heat mirages and the monotonous routine of roll calls and meager rations defined existence, Allied intelligence operatives conducted experiments in psychological deconstruction. They sought not just tactical information, but the total collapse of allegiance. The atmosphere inside the segregated compounds was thick with suppressed hostility and the pervasive smell of stale sweat, damp earth, and institutional disinfectant. Our focus narrows to 5 men, separated by rank, service, and nationality, yet linked by the sudden, terrifying exposure to truths that rendered their entire previous existence a complex lie. These 5 individuals were carefully selected targets, each representing a critical ideological structure of the Axis powers. They were housed in a specialized, low-slung administrative block, a building whose windows were always tightly shut against the omnipresent dust, creating an interior world defined by the harsh, unblinking glare of unshaded electric bulbs. The first was Oberlieutenant Richter, a man whose presence spoke of height and unforgiving discipline. Richter was a pilot, a member of the Luftwaffe's elite. Recognized by the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head and the unwavering steadiness of his gaze. Even stripped of his rank insignia and confined to the coarse, standardized prison garb, he retained the severe elegance of his former life. The polished leather of his discarded flight jacket, which he was occasionally permitted to handle during structured sessions, a psychological anchor, smelled faintly of ozone and expensive European oil. A stark contrast to the sterile air of the holding room. His ideology was rooted in a professional soldier's creed: efficiency, technological supremacy, and the glorious aesthetics of aerial combat. He viewed the war as a calculated, necessary conflict fought by superior minds and machines. Beneath the stoicism, however, lay a deep, almost invisible fissure of doubt, centered on the increasing numerical reality of German defeat that even Reich propaganda could not fully obfuscate. Beside him, figuratively and sometimes physically, sat Major Krell, the SS administrative officer. Krell was the epitome of the bureaucrat elevated to ideological purist. He possessed a slight frame, tightly cropped sandy hair, and severe steel-rimmed spectacles that magnified the clinical precision in his pale blue eyes. Krell's uniform, even in its rough-spun prison state, always seemed cleaner, pressed flatter than anyone else's. His allegiance was not to the battlefield, but to the system itself, to the complex, interwoven machinery of racial purity, logistics, and total control. His initial arrogance was a palpable force, radiating from him like heat from a boiler. An intellectual certainty based on volumes of carefully selected state doctrine. He believed himself immune to emotional weakness, relying instead on legalistic definitions and ideological abstracts. To insulate himself from the horrific realities his administration facilitated. The third subject was Corporal Tanaka, a Japanese Imperial Army infantryman. Tanaka was smaller than the Germans, his uniform perpetually smelling of damp canvas and dried sweat, reminiscent of the tropical battlefields from which he had been captured. His adherence to the emperor was not just ideological, it was existential. His world was structured by the codified honor of the Bushido spirit, demanding absolute sacrifice and rejection of surrender. His silence was profound, broken only by clipped, formal responses. His body held in an unnatural stiffness, born of relentless discipline. Allied intelligence recognized that breaking Tanaka meant fracturing the foundation of his soul, challenging the divine mandate that legitimized the war in Asia. His only sensory comfort was the smooth, polished wood of a small, unauthorized carving, a tiny depiction of Mount Fuji, which he constantly rubbed between his thumb and index finger, a tactile reminder of the homeland he was taught he must never return to in dishonor. Completing the group of 5 were 2 Wehrmacht soldiers, archetypes of the exhausted common fighting man. There was Sergeant Klaus, a communications specialist, older, his face etched with the grime and weariness of years, spent maintaining fragile wires under fire. He smelled perpetually of stale smoke and damp wool, and his shoulders carried the permanent slump of perpetual fatigue. His ideology was not philosophical zeal, but basic patriotism and the camaraderie of the front line. He fought for his comrades, and for the belief that Bolshevism must be stopped. His comrade, Private Hans, was younger, barely 20, taken prisoner during the Normandy campaign. Hans represented the generation that had known no reality outside the Hitler Youth and the relentless propaganda machine. His belief was simpler, built on fear and the fervent, youthful absorption of slogans he hadn't yet learned to decode. The Allied interrogation process, particularly for this group, moved far beyond the immediate extraction of military secrets. It was a calculated, deep dive into psychological vulnerability, managed by specialists, linguists, historians, and psychologists. The heavy, institutional light illuminated the dust motes dancing over the worn page. The heavy, institutional light illuminated the dust motes dancing over the worn page, drawing a stark focus to the definition of truth. The oppressive fluorescence cast shadows over the empty chair, awaiting the next confession in this sterile, claustrophobic space. Decades of fluorescent heat had warped the air above the peeling green paint, defined only by the razor edge of an unforgiving shadow. The scarred wood bears witness to bygone eras of sound, as the fragile acetate spins beside the looming metal eye of the 16mm projector. History is not only written by the victors, it is cataloged by them. The physical evidence of the documentation disparity was staggering. Richter maintained his rigid posture, the defiance in his gaze warring silently against the beads of exhaustion trickling down his brow. The rigid grip barely concealed the tension of the moment. Every stark, sterile chart confirmed the catastrophic downward trend of Luftwaffe capacity. Under the harsh light, the pulverized landscape confirmed the devastating truth. The crumpled propaganda offered no comfort now. Precision warfare found its target, a clear suburban street, reduced to a single coordinate on the stark aerial photograph. Miller held Richter's gaze, his academic composure barely masking the slight critical tension around his eyes. Miller's low, unwavering words confirmed the grid coordinates. Richter felt the weight of the gray ash settle deeper than any shadow. Every sharp tap on the grainy output was Richter's precise frustration, arguing that the machine's integrity could not be compromised by poor resolution. Swallowed by the evidence, Richter faced a combined historical burden, the sheer volume of paper turning clarity into an impossible dream. Sleep refused to come. Instead, the darkness compelled him to calculate, mapping his anxieties onto the indifferent concrete. The expensive, highly polished brown leather now carried an unmistakable, sickly odor. Subtly reflected in its surface was the cold, unfeeling machinery of the enemy's production line. The capacity chart plummeted into the sickly yellow light. Richter's features collapsed into professional horror, disgusted less by the morality than the utter, unforgivable waste. The stoicism shattered, leaving only the cold, crushing weight of what the numbers had long predicted. This was the final answer. Major Krell analyzed Miller through lenses that mirrored abstract, terrifying logic. He saw not a man, but a problem set waiting for a solution. The logic was undeniable. The resulting consequences were now palpable dust. The precision of Krell's magnified marginalia cuts through the cold finality of the administrative stack, revealing the human hand within the bureaucracy. This logistical directive calculates human capacity and chemical supply with chilling precision. The dry, horrifying paperwork details the operation as a simple supply chain problem. Take a good look at this. Everything you thought you knew about the mission ends right here. The spotlight focuses on the chilling bureaucratic detail, a confirmed signature authorizing the order for 400 liters of Zyklon B. Miller's steady hand placed the final report, its staggering casualty count written in bold black ink next to the initial filing. The mundane act only amplified the horror. He saw the final sum, the mask of intellect shattered, leaving only the raw, cold dread of confirmation. Krell leaned forward, his face a furious mask of legalistic denial. Only the white-knuckled grip on the table betrayed the disciplined rage he struggled to suppress. Richter's numerical chaos met Krell's fractured geometry. The intellectual rigidity of both data and structure guaranteed a unified collapse. The immaculate requisition list finally snapped into focus, mirroring the cold, absolute truth suddenly dawning in Krell's eyes. The magnifying glass brings unforgiving clarity to the historical horror, detailing the grainy text. The magnifying glass brings unforgiving clarity to the historical horror, detailing the grainy texture of suffering captured within the faded photograph. He saw his own pen not as a tool, but a weapon. The true optimization was the horror he had become. The final ledger entry, labeled disinfection, was rendered in the calculated horror of bone dust and visceral red light. The lenses magnified Krell's terror, reflecting back the calm, patient face of the man who was simply waiting for him to break. For Corporal Tanaka, the indoctrination was spiritual and cultural, requiring a deeper, more brutal psychological assault. The Allied goal was to prove the Emperor's divinity was a manufactured illusion. His sacrifice, demanded in the name of honor, was fundamentally meaningless. Tanaka was subjected to uncensored Allied newsreels projected onto the bare wall of the observation room. These films were unlike the heavily censored footage provided by the Imperial Japanese Army. They showed not glorious charges, but the grinding, brutal reality of overwhelming defeat. American tanks crushing defenses on Peleliu, Japanese soldiers, emaciated and burned, surrendering en masse. And perhaps most devastatingly, images of the civilian population in mainland Japan suffering under intense firebombing, far from the promised safety. The greatest shock, however, came from the audio. Allied intelligence played recordings of American radio broadcasts, not propaganda. These were broadcasts intercepted directly from Tokyo, featuring the emperor's voice announcing Japan's capitulation. The quiet, high-pitched resonance of Hirohito's voice filtered through static. It acknowledged the unendurable suffering and the end of hostilities, and was played and replayed for Tanaka. His reaction was not immediate anger, but a profound physical tremor. The air in the room seemed to crackle around him. His entire life had been predicated on the idea that the emperor would never speak of surrender. He believed that death was preferable to defeat, and that the imperial army was invincible. The very texture of the air, the dry metallic scent of the hot projector lamp, the sound of the looping acetate disc, all merged into a sensory experience of betrayal. When confronted with evidence of other Japanese soldiers surrendering alive, and then the ultimate admission of failure from the divine source itself. Tanaka's discipline collapsed inward, his rigid posture dissolved. He sat immobile, his hands gripping the tiny wooden carving of Fuji so tightly his knuckles turned. He sat immobile, his hands gripping the tiny wooden carving of Fuji so tightly his knuckles turned white. He was unable to reconcile the visceral, sensory reality of defeat with the manufactured certainty of his faith. The shame was suffocating, leading not to resistance, but to a silent, devastating paralysis. The internal landscape of his loyalty was utterly annihilated. The two Wehrmacht soldiers, Klaus and Hans, experienced a different, more generalized form of disillusionment, tailored to their working-class sensibilities. Their interrogations focused on scarcity, betrayal, and the sheer cost of the war to the common German citizen. Klaus, the veteran communications specialist, was shown detailed comparative economic graphs. These demonstrated the massive, disproportionate suffering of the German civilian population compared to the relative luxury maintained by the Nazi elite. He was shown photographic evidence, not of camps, but of bombed-out German worker housing. This was contrasted with untouched, lavish villas belonging to high-ranking party officials in Berchtesgaden. The message was simple. While he was freezing and risking his life for the fatherland, the elite were hoarding resources and ensuring their own comfort. For a man whose loyalty was tethered to the perceived fairness of the national struggle, this was a potent poison. Klaus was confronted with audio recordings of German housewives complaining bitterly about the lack of basic foodstuffs and the black market prices. These were the real, textured sounds of economic desperation that contradicted the state's pronouncements of unified sacrifice. He recognized the tone, the accent, the deep-seated weariness of his own people. The smell of stale smoke that clung to his uniform now seemed to symbolize the ashes of his hope, the collective misery he had helped prolong. Young Hans, whose indoctrination was the freshest and therefore the most fragile, was shown the purely grotesque. He was given raw, uncensored photographs of civilian casualties inflicted by German forces in occupied territories. Images showed shattered stonework of ancient villages, the blank, dead eyes of non-combatants, the raw, visceral carnage. This carnage had been carefully edited out of his mandated worldview. For Hans, who believed in the idealized soldier's honor, the pictures introduced a chaotic element of moral filth. The texture of the glossy photographic paper, the cold feel of the edges as he handled the images. The sheer, undeniable reality of the depicted butchery broke through the clean, abstract narratives of the Hitler Youth. When he saw a close-up image of a starving child staring directly into the camera lens, the fabricated certainty of his ideology shattered. It wasn't about statistics or strategy. It was about human suffering, raw and immediate. He wept, not tears of political remorse, but of profound, panicked guilt, and the realization that his service had been twisted into something unrecognizable and monstrous. The atmosphere of the interrogation room transformed over weeks. It ceased to be a venue of hostile exchange and became, instead, a site of agonizing self-reassessment. The heavy silence between the presentations of evidence was often more potent than any spoken accusation. The heat of the Texas summer, pressing in against the closed doors, seemed to amplify the internal pressure on these men. Richter, once concerned with the polish of his boots and the structural integrity of his aircraft, began to meticulously document his own internal shifts. He filled pages of prison-issued notebooks with frantic, precise calculations. He was attempting to find a mathematical explanation for the moral bankruptcy he was confronting. He realized that the technological prowess he admired was ultimately subservient to an insane, fundamentally unsustainable political ambition. Krell's transformation was perhaps the most clinical and terrifying. Once confronted with irrefutable evidence of the monstrous outcome of his efficiency, he did not seek moral redemption. Instead, he became obsessed with the process of deception itself, studying how the Reich had managed to create such a massive, airtight structure of lies. He started analyzing the propaganda methodology, the frequency of broadcasts, the specific visual tropes used in films, detaching himself from the emotional horror and focusing solely on the structural engineering of control. He documented the collapse of belief as if writing a manual on counter-ideological warfare, his spectacles reflecting the harsh light as he charted the exact moment reality had breached the state-manufactured certainty. Tanaka, after the Emperor's audio was played, retreated into a state of deep, functional melancholy. He began talking, not about military tactics, but about the texture of the soil in his village, the sound of the wind through the rice paddies, reclaiming the visceral, tangible reality of his homeland over the abstract, deified vision of the empire. The Allied psychological victory lay in returning him to his humanity, proving that his life, even in defeat, was more valuable than the prescribed noble death. The Allied intelligence teams understood that the ideological fidelity of the Axis soldiers was deeply intertwined with their identity. Shattering that fidelity required not just presenting facts, but forcing a collision between deeply held sensory memories and brutal, objective sensory input. The feeling of the cold, glossy photographic paper contradicted the warm, patriotic sentiment of radio broadcasts. The smell of disinfectant in the observation room stood in stark opposition to the idealized smells of fresh leather or homeland soil. The climax of this process was the recording of their individual testimonies. These confessions, or rather, documented ideological shifts, were captured on fragile 78 RPM acetate discs stored in climate-controlled archives, physical artifacts of psychological victory. The act of recording itself was intense. The microphone was a bulky silver object placed on the scarred table. The silence of the room, punctuated only by the faint hiss and click of the recording needle tracing its groove, forced absolute presence. Richter's voice, when recorded, was measured, technical, and dry, detailing the specific moment he realized the numerical impossibility of victory, confessing that his loyalty had been misplaced in machinery rather than morality. Krell's testimony was a chilling, detached analysis of his own corruption, a clinical description of how a highly efficient bureaucracy could transform human beings into categories of destruction. He spoke less about feeling and more about the mechanism of deception, confirming the intricate web of lies that stretched from Berlin to the remotest battlefields. Tanaka spoke in short, formal bursts, detailing the profound cultural shock of realizing that the ultimate authority, the emperor, had capitulated, without requiring the mass suicidal resistance he had been prepared to execute. He confirmed the deep societal pressure to embrace an honorable death, and the devastating cognitive dissonance when he realized that death was demanded merely to prolong a failed political structure. These recorded acetate discs represented the ultimate proof of the Allied thesis that the collapse of the Axis war machine was often preceded by the quiet, devastating collapse of belief within its most loyal soldiers. The records captured the precise psychological mechanisms utilized to shatter ideological devotion, not through physical coercion, but through the relentless, targeted application of documented truth. When the war finally ended, the men in the segregated compound were left adrift in a moral vacuum. They had witnessed the failure of their states, yes, but more profoundly, they had been forced to dismantle the architecture of their own minds. They walked out of the observation room carrying not military secrets, but the heavy, irreversible knowledge of their own extensive deception. The dust of the Texas camp still adhered to their rough woolen uniforms, but inside, the polished, inflexible structure of their ideology had disintegrated, leaving behind a complex, fragile mosaic of guilt, shame, and newly found, terrifying objectivity. The silence of the remote facility contained a profound echo, the sound of deeply held certainties breaking apart, one undeniable fact at a time. Recorded meticulously for history on a handful of fragile spinning discs, they were no longer soldiers of the Axis. They were men burdened by the truth, forever marked by the cold, unforgiving light of the interrogation room.